What makes podcast a better marketing tool than, say, all the others out there?
Humanizing the brand, right? I think
Yes.
one of the biggest ways of doing it through this, right? That's why it becomes such an important marketing tool for a B2B company. Access and engagement with the
Yeah.
right stakeholders. That is such an important thing.
It's pretty easy to create a podcast, right? There's so many popping up. So it should be easy for brands as well, right?
Most companies that we talk to have launched podcasts in the past, and most of them don't ever go beyond the third to seventh or eighth episode.
Do you think the format really plays a role?
All the top business podcasts today are all virtual, and that's for a reason. People care more about the content.
Good podcast versus great podcast.
This is going to be a slightly longish answer, so brace yourself.
So with all of this content being generated with AI today, with the ease of great systems, having mics, equipment, access to all of these things, it's pretty easy to create a podcast, right? There's so many popping up. So it should be easy for brands as well, right? Why are we saying that, you know what, as brands, you come to us and we'll create a great podcast for you?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question. So if I had to summarize your question in a way, should a brand do this
Internally,
themselves
yeah.
or whether they should outsource it to an expert like Ranx Podcast, right? That's your question, right?
Yeah.
So it's easy for brands to launch a podcast. It's difficult for brands if they're doing it internally to sustain a podcast. Right now, this data could be slightly different depending on which country and which type of company that you look at. But from our research, what we've seen is most companies that we talk to have launched podcasts in the past, and most of them don't ever go beyond the third to seventh or eighth episode. It's done by the eighth episode. If you're trying to do it internally, more often than not, it fizzles out. And that's the experience most companies, brands are coming in and telling us. And, there's some research data that shows that as well, right? Because while it may look simple to do, it is very difficult to sustain a podcast, right? And that's the reason why if you want to have a podcast that is sustainable, right? That you do over a period of time, you need to outsource it to an expert because it's not, otherwise you're going to have to set up a huge team internally. And I don't think making a podcast is a core part of somebody's business operation, like it is for us, right? So if I have to summarize what I've just said, launching a podcast internally for a company is easy. Sustaining it over a long period of time is impossible. The data shows that most companies do 3 to 7 episodes and it fizzles out. And we've seen that from our conversations with our clients as well, right? So that's the stat because, and now why is this, right? Why does this happen, right? Because there are lots of elements that are there in podcasts that seem easy, but are not easy to do. Okay. So let me start with just conceptualizing a podcast. I think there is so much thought that needs to be put into what will you call your podcast, right? Just that is so important. And in subsequent episodes, we'll get into possibly each one of these aspects, right? How should you go about naming your podcast, right? And that can lead to the success or failure of it, right? What is your content mix in the podcast, right? So what are the different categories that you're going to kind of bifurcate your podcast guests in, right? That you do. So, that's such an important part of whether you can create a sustainable podcast or not, because most people don't have the expertise internally to even think about how to bifurcate, different segments or different guests, right, in it, right? So this is just the conceptualizing stage where there's so much of thought that goes into how do you name your podcast, how do you bifurcate the content, what type of guests do you call? That's one aspect of it, right? And many other aspects which I'm not getting into here, right? The second aspect is just getting the right guests on your podcast. That is so difficult. And why is it so difficult? Because that is almost a sales job where you write to a guest and then you follow up with him a good 20 times for you through calls, emails, messages, for you to get that guest to say yes, and then to coordinate his schedule with, when the show needs to be shot, etc. Right? So that's a huge operational task that people don't realize, right? They think, oh, I'm going to send one message to somebody, because more often than not, as guests, you're trying to get for want of a better word, important, busy people, right? That's who you're trying to get, influential people in some way. And these people, their time is not easy, and they get like, literally hundreds of invites for different events, activities, even podcasts, right? So for them to actually choose yours over some other activity that they need to do, that only happens when you conceptualize stuff properly. That only happens when you really follow up with them consistently. That's when they know that you're serious, right about it. If they just get one email, they're not even sure whether that's a AI generated spam or scam email. They don't even know that, right? But when a consistent follow up happens by a human calling them on a show, besides the emails that need to be shot out for that, that's when they're like, okay, this is real, right? So number one, conceptualizing it is difficult. Number two, just the aspect of getting the right guests on the show is a very difficult part, right, of it, right? Number three then is the actual expertise that you need in terms of creating the podcast, right? Which I mean that if you're doing a virtual podcast, right, this, so much of post production work that goes into that, right? Which is there. You need to convert the show into a reels format, a shorts format, a clips format. How do you do all of those things? There's a certain amount of expertise that are required. You need video editors to do it. You need people that know how to correct videos, color correct, so on and so forth. So like different things, right? If you're doing it an in-person physical one, again, there's a need of a certain expertise that is there, right, from the video production side. These are just three of the core elements that are there that makes it almost impossible for a company or brand to do this internally if you want to do it on a long term basis. Right now, the last point that I want to share here is, if any company is thinking about doing a podcast, you need to think about doing it for at least 3 years. My take is you need to think of doing it in perpetuity, right? Exactly like your social media channels that you have, you don't start and stop them, right?
Right.
You just run your social media channels because it's important, right?
It's not just a project.
It's not a project, right? It's not a one-time thing where you're going to start and stop that. You're going to do it in perpetuity. And exactly like that, you need to think about podcasts, right? This is a project that you do in perpetuity. So if you're going to do it in perpetuity, or in the long run, you need somebody who's an expert that can do it, because that's the time when your podcast will actually gain some prominence, right, from people. And again, I wanna share, but probably we can discuss it later as to how should brands be thinking, right, about their podcast, and what are the typical kind of mistakes that they make in some way, right? We can discuss that later. But again, since if you're going to think of podcasts, think of it from the long run, which is a minimum of running it for 3 years, but actually in perpetuity. Then if you have to do that, I think a brand or company will have a realization that they can't do it themselves and they need to go to an expert for it, right? Does that make sense to you, Ron?
Yeah, it does, of course. And approach of it not being a project or not just being a novel new thing that we're starting, right? I think that thought process is very important. With all of the elements that you mentioned, right? Why is it that you need an expert? Now tell me, Swapnil, a production house which works on ad films and things like that has a big portion of these capabilities. Digital media agency, they have a lot of contacts, they can get a lot of people on board. So why Ranx versus going to a production house or a digital media agency?
Correct. So again, great question, right? Let me break that down from a production house, a video production house, right? And we know so many of this. We also worked with so many of this. They understand video production, right? But they don't have the infrastructure to a lot of times conceptualize it. They don't have a deep understanding of podcasts in terms of even understanding how do you name this particular podcast, right? What type of guests do you call? They don't really understand the business part of it, right? They know how to produce a video, but they can't connect how is this podcast going to help your business growth in some way, right? They can't do that connection. That's where our expertise really comes in, right? The next part that a video production agency can't do in most cases is they do not have the infrastructure to do the guest coordination. the guest follow-up, because like I said, that is almost a parallel sales activity, right? To get the right guests on board. So most production agencies don't have the infrastructure to do that. They don't have the expertise to do that. And that's why it tends to die down, right? If you say, if any company says, listen, I'm going to call the guests and you just, shoot this thing, maybe they'd be able to do it, right? Because, and that's what most companies are doing right now. And that's why they can shoot 3 to 7 episodes, and then the entire initiative fizzles out, right? And this has happened again and again and again and again, right? Only the companies that outsource it to the right kind of podcast experts like us internationally, those are the only people that have managed to kind of really build a sustainable podcast, and therefore see the business impact of building that sustainable long-term podcast, right? So yeah, that would be my answer to that, right? If I have to summarize again quickly, lack of understanding of how to conceptualize it. Number two, I think not an in-depth understanding of how podcasts connect to business growth in some way, right? And number three, I think video production companies more often than not don't have the infrastructure of getting the right guests, because it requires almost a sales job to be done. There's a lot of follow-up which is there, right? So these are the three reasons why video production companies don't work.
That makes so much sense, right? Because the objective of why one is starting a podcast gets lost.
Yeah.
And then one may think that, podcasts don't work.
Yeah.
But it's about how you've approached it, who you've got on board to make it, right?
Very good. Very interesting. I want to add to that, Rosh, right?
Yeah.
So, this is just from our own business development team speaking to clients, right? So, one of the first things that a lot of them tend to say to us is, hey, we've tried podcasts. We want to do podcasts, but it hasn't worked for us in the past, right? And we're quite happy to hear that, because we're like, okay, now let us come in and be the experts and guide you through this process of doing it, right? And you ask them 2 or 3 questions, and often we're like, okay, how did you try to do this internally? They're like, yeah. And then we're like, oh, cool. Now you know why it doesn't work internally, right? There are cases where they say, no, we got a video production agency. We're like, okay, did this happen? They'd be like, yeah, this is exactly what happened, right? Because they could do, the video part for it, but they didn't understand any of the other parts, right? And therefore it became something that we couldn't do beyond the, 3rd or 7th episode, right? So meeting after meeting with our lovely clients where, they're saying the exact same thing to us, right? And that's why we know that it's the same trend, it's the same trend all over the world.
Yeah. And do you think the format of podcasts play a role in really being able to sustain it? So what I mean by that is, if you see some beautiful elaborate setups where there's great you've got a great studio, you've got a great garden setup, and there's a lovely table and the background's great, and then you've got podcasts, say like this one, where we're just sitting with blurred backgrounds and having a chat. Do you think the format really plays a role?
Very interesting, right? And it's going to be a slightly longish answer. So brace yourself for this slightly longish answer, right? So my first point is, if you're thinking of doing a podcast over a long period of time, as every brand should, it needs to be cost effective, right? And it needs to, in a way, be easy to do in some format, right? Because if it's not cost effective and it's very cumbersome with a lot of friction there, it will die out, right? So you need to look at everything from the lens of saying, I'm going to do this over the long run. So it needs to be cost effective, and it needs to be something which minimal amount of friction, which is there, right? These are the 2 key aspects to a podcast, right? Now, second point, let me take you back to the history of podcasts in some way, right? So if you remember the history of podcast was primarily an audio format, right? Which was there. It wasn't really a video format. And then I think rightly so, right? It became a video audio format, right? Because people started consuming it like on YouTube and Spotify videos, so on and so forth, right? And because human beings, of course, are visual creatures, right? And we like seeing the visual. But Rosh, if you look at the most popular business podcasts, right, all over the world, they're all virtually shot, right? Which means, look at the All-In podcast, right? There's no big production which is there. It's just 4 or 5 people getting on a call exactly like this and having a robust, interesting, useful, informative discussion, right? That's what they're doing. and that's what people are loving, and that's why it's one of the best business podcasts that is there. If you look at My First Million, I love that podcast. I think the two hosts there are like amazing. They do a fantastic job. Virtual podcast, right? They're sitting exactly like the two of us are, and they're having a great discussion on something which is really useful for people, right? And therefore, when it comes to brands and corporate podcasts, we typically say go virtual as far as possible, right? Now, why is that? It's easy for you to do. Just get on a Zoom call or whatever software that we'd use. Get on one of those calls. Easy. We're used to it, right? That's number one. Number two, guests are much more comfortable, right? Coming on a Zoom call or doing a virtual one because they do so many meetings on it, right? Versus the physical setup being done, right? Number three, both from the point of view of the host and the guest, right? They don't need to disrupt their entire day, right? To do it, right? They don't need to do that, right? It's just 1 hour from their day that they can do between meetings, right? So it's so much more convenient for the guest. Number four, there is no travel involved, right? So if you're going to do a physical format, you're essentially saying that I can call people only from my city, or then I'm going to have to travel for the podcast. And sometimes both of those things are not possible, right? Yeah. So that's why virtual podcast really answers all of those. It's going to be more cost effective than doing it in person. And that's why, for businesses and brands, especially if they want to make it something which is sustainable and do it over a period of time, we recommend them going the virtual route because of all the reasons that I've mentioned, right? So, just to do a recap, number one, all the top business podcasts today are all virtual, and that's for a reason. People care more about the content, right, than they care about the visual, right, of it, right? So that's number one. Number two, it's far more easier both for the host and the guest, right, to do a virtual podcast because it doesn't disrupt their entire day as it would if you have to physically travel to some place. Number three, you can get guests from all over the world, right, for your podcast if you're doing it virtually versus doing it physically, right? And that really makes a big difference to stuff. And lastly, I don't know whether I'm saying this point again, but it is far more cost effective as well, generally, and with lesser friction, which was there, right? So, and again, I would like to share all of this comes from our own personal experience too, right? When we first launched our podcast at Work Better, the first episode we did a physical episode in our own studio, right? That we did it, and then we realized all these things that I've just shared, right, with you, because it cost more, disrupted everybody's day, just so many things, right? And then we said, hey, this is unsustainable if you want to really do this over a long period of time, right? And then we moved it to virtual. Everything became so much easier, right? For the guests, for us, for everyone, and had the exact same impact that we wanted to have, right? So yeah, and I have just, by the way, nothing against somebody doing elaborate sets and stuff like that, right? Tomorrow, if a business brand company has huge budgets, right, and if they say, hey, listen, budget is absolutely no problem for us, right, but we want to do it in person, well, great, then you should do it in person, right? Because then what you're essentially saying is, that you'll spend so much more on just every element, flying a guest in from wherever or flying yourself out when required, the camera, the crew, just about everything. If a brand has unlimited budget, I would still not recommend it, but okay, then you should go about doing it. But then what happens is brands will also start looking for saying that, hey, what am I getting as a result of this thing, right? I spend so much money of it, but I'm only getting so many views, right? And then it becomes a very short-term engagement, right? Because most brands will look for an ROI on what they're doing. And if you're going to spend so much money, you're not going to get that ROI immediately, because the ROI on podcasts is a more long-term ROI that you get, right? Sometimes it'll work for you much quicker, but sometimes it will take that time, right? So
I think that perspective Swapnil, you've given is so important, right? But there's one point I want us to address here, right?
Yeah.
Is the question of quality. Because even when I've had multiple conversations, I'm always told, oh, no, virtual podcasts, the quality is not great. And, audio, there may be a problem, or video, there may be a problem. So I want us to address that point. So tell me what you think about that.
Correct. So the audio part today is more or less a solved problem with all the post-production tools that you have, right? And if you use again a decent mic like this, I think the audio problem is solved totally. Number two, most internet connections today are far more robust, right? So the lags are fewer. Number three, with blurred backgrounds and a little bit of post-production, you can increase the quality even of a virtual podcast, right? So I don't think that's a problem anymore, right? Like it used to be. And just another suggestion for any brands or companies that are watching this, right? If you're hell bent on doing something which is in person, we have no problem. We will execute it for you.
Yeah.
Then what we would recommend is to do a hybrid, right? So a few of them you can do in person, and the rest you can do virtually, right? Which is what most podcasts end up doing, right? They do a mix of both things, right? Every company, marketing manager, marketing head that's watching this needs to realize is you're not a podcaster, right? You're using your podcast as a means to a business end, right? And therefore, because you're not a podcaster, right, that's not your core business. That's just one of the many marketing tools that you're going to deploy for business growth. You need to think of everything from an ROI point of view. And that's exactly how we're thinking of it, right? We're thinking about how do you get returns on the money that you're going to spend on the podcast. And when you think of it from that lens, you will realize that the solution that we're giving you is a far better solution that will help meet your business growth or business objectives by spending the right amount of money on it, right? So that's the kind of solution that we give you. Again, going back to your previous question, if you go to a production company, they're going to say no, you need to do a physical one, right? Because they're obsessed with the production quality or something. We are obsessed with helping our customers get the business results that they're looking for through this particular podcast, right? That is our obsession, right? And helping you get an ROI, because we're business people ourselves, right? So we know that any activity that doesn't give an ROI in the end is not going to be something that is going to be sustainable for companies. So our focus is that as the experts on this subject.
And I think this differentiator is so important because it's very easy to get deterred and suddenly worry about the quality of your output, the quality of what your brand is going to put up, and then like, no, we'd rather not go that way, or let's not do virtual podcasts, but not losing sight of this objective and what we're trying to achieve is so important over here, right? Then when you work backwards from there, it just makes sense.
Correct. And if you look at just some of the companies, brands around the world that are running their podcasts, most of them, again, are either hybrid or virtual, right? If they're doing it over a long period of time. And I'm not talking about a company that, does 3 episodes in the whole year, because in my opinion, that's almost a useless activity, right? When you do 3 or 6 episodes and you shoot it in the most elaborate way in a year, I don't think brands should do that at all, right? You need to look at a frequency for your podcast, which is ideally, if you ask me, once every week, right? But at least once every 2 weeks, right? So either close to 48 podcasts a year if you're going to do it roughly once a week, or 24 podcasts, right, in the year is what you should look at doing. And therefore, it doesn't make sense for somebody to just do 3 podcasts, right? And coming back, brands around the world that have been using this strategy very effectively, most of them are doing either virtual only, or they're doing hybrid, which is primarily virtual, and a few of them in the physical format, right? And I'm talking about the world's biggest brands, right? In both the B2B and B2C space, right? Literally the biggest brands is what I'm talking about. And I think most companies should know that what we're saying is the more logical way about doing it. This comes from a space of us being able to do both, but we're advising you on what the right thing is to do for you.
Yeah. I love that we've spoken about how to look at podcasts, right? Because today people talk about the setup of podcasts, who's on the podcast, but really what's the thought, what's the objective, especially when it comes to brands, right? I love that we've broken that down so beautifully, Swapnil. And now I want you to tell us, Good podcast versus great podcast, because there's just so many podcasts out there today, right?
Yeah.
What makes a podcast great versus just a good one?
Correct. If I have to, I'm going to try to boil it down to, I think, two or three things, right?
Hmm.
A great podcast is a great conversation, if
Hmm.
you ask me, between two people, right? I think that's the core aspect. A great podcast is a great conversation. And I know podcasts have different forms.
Hmm.
Here, I'm concentrating on the most popular form of podcasting, which is more an interview, Q&A, or discussion
Hmm.
format. But yeah, and I think a great conversation is a great podcast. Number two, where the guests are authentic and real with each other, that is what makes a great podcast, right? So if somebody is going to be very formal, artificial, give very, politically correct answers, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
That doesn't make for a very interesting podcast, right? It needs to be something where the guests are being authentic, they're being honest, they're being direct, they're being candid. That's something where people enjoy that, right? People don't enjoy artificial kind of
But how can you
conversations, right?
elicit that, Swapnil? Right? When you've got a guest and a host, how do you think that can be elicited?
Yeah, I think if you've seen people that are good hosts are
Hmm.
very good at asking the right kind of questions. They're very
Hmm.
good at making the guest comfortable. They're very good at conversations, basically, right?
Hmm.
So it takes somebody that's a decent host to do that, right? There's a certain amount of expertise that is required there. A good host can, even if the guest on the other side is introvertish, doesn't have a
Hmm.
lot of practice in having these
Yeah.
kind of conversations, he can make them feel very comfortable, ask the right kind of questions, be authentic, be genuine, and you'll find the guest on the other side really opening up and even them having a lovely and amazing conversation with you, right? So a lot of that goes to the host, right? So just going back to what's a good podcast series versus a great
Hmm.
podcast series, like I said, number one would be just an interesting conversation, right? Focus on that. Don't focus on anything else, right? Number two is it needs to be like real, authentic, candid, direct, right?
Hmm.
Those are the things that people enjoy versus it being scripted in some
Right.
way, artificial, scripted. People don't like that. They can see through that bullshit, right? They don't want that, right? The other kind of, I think, a podcast needs to be useful for people, right?
Hmm.
Which means that they need to get something out of it, right? Now, the usefulness of it could be you learn something from the podcast
Hmm.
in the form of some insights that you get, some existing information that gets reiterated in your head in some
Hmm.
form. The usefulness could be in terms of you being entertained in some way, right? So it could be that, but that podcast needs to be of some value or use to the person watching it, right?
Right.
In some format, right? So I think that's something that is an important characteristic of a great podcast series. And if you ask me from a brand's point of view or a company's point of view, right, having different kinds of guests really makes a big difference, right?
Hmm.
So you just don't have one type of a guest, right? You get a host of different kind of guests, right? And therefore cover different type of topics, right?
Hmm.
That tends to make a good podcast in a good podcast series, right? So it's got little to do with whether it's virtual or in person, and
Hmm.
it's got more to do with all these things than that, right? Which is there. But yeah, this would be my few things, and there, of course, there are lots of other elements that we'll keep discussing as we go on, right? Of
Yeah.
what is the difference between an average podcast and a great podcast, right? But these are a few elements.
Yeah. So when it comes to marketing, right? Today, marketing, digital marketing, there's
Yeah,
you want outcomes, you want ROI,
yeah,
right? Every team you talk to, every pitch you make, that's the question you've got to answer. You answer that satisfactorily, you have the
yeah,
project, right?
yeah.
What makes podcast a better marketing tool than, say, all the others out there?
Correct. First of all, I would resist from saying better or worse because as a marketeer, you need to do many different things
Hmm.
to bring value to your company, right? So doing performance marketing has its own space and a very
Hmm.
important space. Depending on the size of the company, doing TV ads depending on the business that you're in, that has a space. Doing a Super Bowl ad, that has a space in itself. And similarly, kind of podcasts has its own space, right? So I wouldn't say it's better or worse. I would just say it needs to be a part of your overall marketing mix for sure, right? As a marketeer. So that's the first thing that I would say. Number two, I think, like I mentioned earlier, podcast does very specific things for you, right? So it's not something which is a question mark, right? Like I said, for a B2B company, access and engagement with the right stakeholders. That is such an important thing. And then you can go about measuring, right, that in terms of, hey, what is the business that I got from the existing people that I brought on, existing customers that I brought onto the show? Because this deepened relationship, how did that help in me getting more business? How many new customers did I connect with through this particular podcast and start my relationship with it? It's a very specific objective that you're meeting that you can't do through other channels of marketing, right? Thought leadership, right? What are the different ways of building thought leadership, right? So it could be brands could publish white papers. They should continue doing that. It's a very important part, right? They engage different stakeholders in terms of sponsorship for different events. Do that as well. But today, given the fact that so many people are watching podcasts, if you're not going to build thought leadership to podcasts, you're really missing a trick as a marketeer, right? You're doing that. Then the other aspect that we spoke about, right, which is humanizing the brand, right? I think one of the biggest ways of doing it through this, right? That's why it becomes such an important marketing tool. Then when you talk about your customers becoming your brand evangelist, every brand and company, Rosh, they want that so badly, right? But that doesn't tend to happen. It happens so easily through this particular mechanism that is there. And then the video content that you end up creating, right? There's just, you can use that on each and every one of your social media platforms. Brand managers, marketeers, more often than not, they're in a conundrum in terms of what they should put on their social media channels, right? Because, and then they're busy, like, wishing people Merry Christmas and putting some, post of that sort on their social, because they have no clue as to what they need to do beyond the point on that, right? But now all of a sudden you have so much of interesting video content, right, that can actually engage people. Like I said, I wouldn't say, this tool is better than something. All I would say that it needs, as a marketeer, this needs to be an integral part of your overall marketing mix. Why? Because it gives you this very specific result that I spoke about, right? Which is, it may not be perfectly measurable, right, from a ROI point of view, right? Because none of the marketing initiatives are perfectly kind of measurable. But yeah, you can see the real business benefit that comes from it.
Yeah. So, Swapnil, with all of the things we've discussed, the fact that today podcasts are accessible, they're easy to start off. Anyone and everybody today, you can see podcasts popping up, right? These are very obvious points, but I think what comes out very, very strongly is the importance of doing it right.
Yeah.
Right. And we've truly broken that down today, which is what are we looking to achieve and how is it that podcasts can do that for you? So the importance of doing it right, because I think the amount of podcasts we see is going to go up even more, and the importance of doing it right and hitting your mark is going to be even more, right? Because you're going to have a lot more brands doing it, a lot more guests, a lot more evangelists, right? So everybody will, in their self-interest, be promoting the podcast they've been on. But then if you've got the right guests, if you had the right kind of genuine conversation, and they're sharing it in the right circles, then brands are achieving what they want to.
Absolutely.
Right? Which is why I think Ranx can truly bring that value to our clients.
Correct. And just some of the Rosh, the forward-thinking brands around the world and companies around the world are already doing it, right? So we're not really talking about something which is new to the world in any way, right? The benefits of doing a company podcast or a branded podcast, it's already there. You can go to some of the top brands that are doing it well and see it. And as a part of this show and series, we will break down a lot of these podcasts for you as well, and share some of the best practices from there.
I think we've had fun, and although I've spoken with you, Swapnil, for now over a decade. I've still enjoyed this conversation because it's
Me
been
too.
insightful. It's been
Yeah.
interesting, and I'm very excited to put this out there, right?
Yeah.
Because it's
Yeah.
something that we've researched, experienced, and with a lot of confidence, we're taking it to market now.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, I want to end with something that I think we spoke about earlier. I think for all of us, podcasts is also the way in which we learn the most, right? I know that's true of me, that podcast has been over the last decade the way in which I learn the most, right? And that's what we're trying to do, because I think every podcast can be a great learning opportunity for, the people as part of the conversation, right? But also people that are listening to it,
Yeah.
right? So it's such a big tool of learning for the world in some way, right? So that's why I'm very excited about our ability to create as many podcasts as we can for different organizations,
Yeah.
and add to the kind of knowledge ecosystem of the world, right? And I think each one of the podcasts, hopefully, that we do, at least our aim as we do them for all the companies and brands that we do it for, our aim will be to increase the knowledge, right,
Hmm.
base for the world, and help people really, learn a lot through very specific tactics, very specific strategies, very usable stuff, right? So that's going to
Hmm.
be our endeavors when we partner with the brands, partner with the companies, right? So you're also engaged and entertained, but on the
Hmm.
other side, you genuinely take out something from
Yeah,
the
you're learning.
podcast. You learn something from it as well, right? And I'm very excited about that endeavor of, adding to the knowledge ecosystem of the world, right, in some way, because that's how people are learning.